Welcome to Grieving Voices. Today, my guest is Miss Michele Benyo. She is a certified grief recovery specialist, parent mentor, and founder of Good Grief Parenting, whose purpose is to support parents who are raising young bereaved siblings after child loss. Her mission is to be a voice for the youngest of grievers and to help parents nurture and understand the unique needs of children who have lost a sibling in early childhood. When not helping parents, Michele enjoys adventures with her daughter, dinner with friends, seeking out keto recipes to satisfy her sweet tooth, and hiking the woods and lake country of beautiful Minnesota. Thank you so much for being here, Michele.
Yes, well, thank you, Victoria. I'm glad to be here.
And I'm excited to have you here too, because you are a fellow certified grief
Mm-hmm.
recovery specialist.
Yes, yes.
So I know your backstory, but my listeners don't. So would you please share what brings you to Grieving Voices today?
Yes. Well, I have always been in the field of children and families and had my own two children and was a parent educator in early childhood family education, which is part of all the school districts in Minnesota. When my 4.5-year-old son was diagnosed with cancer and my daughter was 15 months old, and we battled that demon for 2.5 years before my son died at the age of 6. And his little sister was 3.5. And she said to me, "Mommy, half of me is gone," when her brother died. They were very close. They were best of friends. It was her only sibling. And here I was in the field of early childhood parent education, and I was so aware of the needs of kids this age, but this was just parenting 101 all over again. It was just not the same thing. And this was 20 years ago. So my daughter is now grown. And back then, I I thought I had access to a lot of resources that a lot of people may not readily have, and yet I could not find anything that really helped me know what she really needed and what to do for her. I mean, she said half of her was gone, and that's heartbreaking, and it's just not okay. And what do you do with that as a parent? Her whole lifetime was ahead of her. So I really knew then that as an early childhood educator, I needed to provide this resource. But I found over the years, as I studied it, I found every book that I could. And over the years, there were a few more resources that became available. And I just learned everything about sibling loss and early childhood loss that I could. And now I am, in the past few years, since my daughter's graduated and is now a young adult, I'm starting to just really try to reach out to all the families I can who have this little child who probably didn't say to them, "Mommy, half of me is gone," but yet had that feeling of really having lost a sense of self when their sibling died. So that's really what my mission is. I say that her simple 6 words are what really defined my very specific purpose of working with families who've lost a child in early childhood, because that's that formative time of life when um, not only are coping skills and social emotional skills being developed in kids, but just that whole sense of who they are going forward. So, yeah.
I just want I'm a mom to three
Mm-hmm.
kids, and I can't even imagine. I've interviewed several parents who have lost children, and
Mm-hmm.
that's a loss I can't
Mm-hmm.
even wrap my head
Mm-hmm.
around. Like it, ugh. I just heard
Yeah.
a song, a friend of mine shared a song with me the other day, just kind of because I was recently reminiscing about how fast time flies and just,
Mm-hmm.
you know, you would never, and even the podcast I recently recorded, I was just reflecting on even with a child loss, it's you you would never take away that relationship or choose to not have
Right.
that relationship or
Right.
experience, even
Mm-hmm.
though it hurts so badly when you lose
Mm-hmm.
that person, right? But
Right.
it doesn't make it any easier. So how did you first really make it through those early days without the resources, you personally, with your grief and in your marriage,
Mm-hmm.
and then
Well,
address that with your daughter?
I I knew right away that what I needed was, or what I wanted was help for her. I really have to say that her loss so far overshadowed mine in my mind. But I also, we were connected with children's hospitals in Minneapolis, and they at that time had a wonderful bereavement program. And I really credit, I mean, that the person who was the bereavement coordinator at the time really was a lifeline for me. And so I had that support through what they offered. And one distinction that I want to make with families is that when you have this tremendous loss, and it is so devastating, and parents never will get over it, they have to learn to assimilate this grief and this loss into your life going forward. And when you have young children, it's like their life can never be quote unquote normal again, because it's got this presence of grief throughout the rest of their life. That doesn't mean we can't be happy and enjoy life, but it just really does change things. But what I want parents to know is that counseling and therapy is not the only way to get the support they need. I knew I didn't need therapy or a counselor. The grief support group was really helpful to me. But then I was on to, okay, now how do I get my family how do we live forward and be happy? And the grief support group didn't help me do that. So that was the piece that was missing. And I will say that as a family, we had gone through my son's cancer as a family. The four of us were together all the time. My daughter was 15 months old when her brother was diagnosed, and he spent much of the next 2.5 years in the hospital. And when we were there, both of us, she was there. And a lot of families don't do that because they don't want to, expose their little kids to that. But the Children's Hospital had such a good resource for the siblings. And I will never, I am so grateful that we made that choice, because without that, my children wouldn't have had the chance to develop the relationship that they did, and for her to have the time she did. And she grew up with an understanding of that, of cancer and what it does, and life and death, and her relationship with her brother, that she never would have had if we had protected her from all of that. And so we went through it very well. But we did end up getting divorced soon after. And a lot of people jumped to the conclusion that we were, that that's what happens. And I don't necessarily agree with that. And in our case, it was a matter of, well, it wasn't because of what we had been through. We actually grieved together very well and mutually supported each other very well, and we still do to this day. But we did end up divorcing within a year after my son died. But so in answer to your question, I felt like I kind of had I had the inner resources. I have a strong faith, and that was huge for me. And along the way in our son's illness, I just got a lot of affirmation from my God that he was in this, and that he was upholding me and upholding our family. And so my focus very early on really became my daughter.
I had goosebumps when you shared about your daughter being able to have the time to develop
Yes,
that relationship
yes.
with her brother. I think back to my end of life doula certification training, where we
Mm-hmm.
talk about just the positive impact that being with the dying has, or the
Mm-hmm.
ill people, people in hospice, what that does for the family members if they
Mm-hmm.
can embrace that,
Mm-hmm.
and what it does for their healing. And I'm also curious though too, because she would have still been quite young when you
Mm-hmm.
divorced.
Mm-hmm.
Was that then also something that you saw as an impact on
Oh,
top of the loss of
absolutely.
her brother?
Absolutely. And I what happened with us was that my husband was unfaithful. And so we tried to mend that, but he um, couldn't. And so um, I very intentionally said, okay, I'm going to have to deal with all of this. I thought of my daughter and I said, okay, we're going to just take all of this at once then, and we're just going to deal with this all at once, because having him in the home under those circumstances wasn't the best either. And in the end, it was sort of just, okay, bite the bullet and say, um, I'm going to just make her life the best I can. One of the things I share with families that was what I took up early on was the whole idea of making lemonade. And it's not a new idea, but the way I look at it is, we got this lemon, and Deanna got way more than her share of lemons at that tender age. And we can either bite the lemon and notice that it's sour and hate that it's sour. We can put it on the counter and say, I'm not going to deal with it and let it rot. Or we can slice it up and say, okay, I've got this lemon. I'm going to add sugar. I'm going to add water. I'm going to stir it. I'm going to make the best lemonade I can. And that was the attitude that I had to have with her life, because I was always looking at her life saying, this is not what I want for my daughter. And to this day, I still feel that way, because I see all the years that she grew up through without her brother. And we live next door to 4 siblings who are my children's ages. So she's grown up her whole life next door to 4 siblings without hers. And so my message for parents, because this probably sounds hopeless, and it's not. It is. I think the idea of the lemonade is, this is what we have, and we don't like it, but we'll make the best of it. And I think the important thing for families to know is that sibling relationship really is important. What I did with Deanna was nurture her relationship with her brother, continue the bonds, which is part of what families are so often told to let go of the child they lose or the loved one that they lose, not to focus on that. I had a woman tell me once that I focused too much on my son, and that probably upset my daughter. She didn't have a clue, frankly, because remembering my son and keeping him part of my daughter's life as someone that had loved her and that she had loved and that she had this connection with was really one of the best things I could have done for her, and is one of the best things that parents can do. So that's something that parents struggle with, I know, because they want to remember their child, and people tell them, no, that's not healthy. But on the contrary, it really is very healthy. And it's a good way to allow their children to maintain that relationship. One story I tell is when my daughter was going into first grade, I think, and she was going to a different school. And she said to me, Mommy, how old would David be if he were alive now? And I told her, and she said, oh, good, then he'd be in school with me. And he wasn't there. He wasn't going to be there. But she took comfort in the fact of knowing that that he would have been if he were alive. And that gave her comfort in some really odd way. So we just make losing a child is so crushing and so devastating, and there's no way we can ever replace that relationship, but there are ways that we can nurture it going forward, and that's really part of my message for parents.
Thank you for sharing all of that. And one thought that came to my mind as I was hearing you talk is this idea that relationship does continue.
Mm-hmm.
And if we don't allow children to give voice to that, we're shutting them down, their
Right.
intuition down, those feelings that those sensations or things that they feel with their loved one being there with them, like I
Mm-hmm.
feel them with me. But if they aren't allowed to communicate that, or the parent gets upset when the child mentions the other child
Mm-hmm.
who's passed away, that really just keeps the child from grieving.
Yes, yes. And research shows the books that are out there now about early childhood or about sibling loss in childhood really support the fact that the adults who have grown up bringing that sibling relationship forward consider that to be such a good thing, that it really has been a good thing for them. And parents are kind of we are afraid of grief. I mean, you're doing this, Victoria, you're talking to people all the time about the ways that people in our lives don't know how to support grievers because we're just, as a society, so afraid of it. And it especially is true with children. And yet the best time to learn about grief and how to deal with grief and how to honor it is when you're a child, because we all experience, well, it isn't always the loss of a sibling or a parent. Sometimes it's, moving or the death of a pet or divorce or something like that. But we all have those experiences in childhood, and those are the times for us to build our resilience skills and our coping skills, and to understand that grief is part of loss of life that we will live with and that we can still live well with. So, yeah.
I love that last line. And I love how you say living forward.
Mm-hmm.
So, what was your experience, your personal experience as a child with grief?
Well, it's interesting you ask that because I do have a story that I share. And Um, part of what I also really feel is true about my being in this place that I'm in now is that it really did start in my childhood with the way that I was parented, because I was quite a sensitive child who was called a crybaby. My feelings, my hurt feelings, my pains were not things that the adults around me liked. When I talk to parents sometimes, or adults, ask them to think about when was the first time you experienced grief, because I guarantee you it was way back in those early years. And the first instance that I remember was a time I grew up on Lake of the Woods in northern Minnesota, where the lake is, goes on. You can't see the edge of it. It goes to the horizon. And I was at the beach with a riding toy named Wally the Walrus, a blow up walrus. And he got away from me and started to float away. And of course, I couldn't get him. And some adults tried to get him, and nobody could get him. And I just had to helplessly watch him drift away. And to this day, I remember that feeling. And it's something different than sadness. It's that sense of loss of something that you'll never get back. And that's a very different feeling. And yes, he was just a riding toy, but I had to stand there and watch him float off into the sun, into the horizon. And I felt so helpless. And of course, the adults around me, you know, were trying to tell me, oh, it's just a riding toy. Oh, we can get another one, or oh, go play without it, or, all of those things that we kind of say to children when what they're feeling is very real. Now, as an adult, I wouldn't have that same feeling about Wally the walrus floating away. But then, it was in my little life, it was quite a crisis. And that's the first experience of grief that I just really vividly remember.
I love that story because, again, you make that distinction between, how we're taught how to acquire things or people
Right.
in our lives, but we're never taught what to do when we lose them.
Right.
Yeah,
Yes.
like we're, taught in grief recovery, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, I'm curious. I'd like to kind of come back to child loss, um, in how your daughter throughout the years, then how you helped her throughout the years, and
Mm-hmm.
how she's been shaped by this loss.
Yes, I had to do a lot of advocating for her, and because um, I recognized that, well, and I want to tell you one more thing about her, as if the words she told me at 3.5, because I really want people who are listening to your podcast to hear this. My daughter is, precocious and articulate, but she's not unique in what she feels. And the first night that my husband and my son were at the hospital, the very first night when her brother was gone, and she was 15 months old then, she wandered around the house just wailing. The sound she was making was terrifying to me. It was inhuman, and I could not comfort her. I would go to her and she'd push me away and throw herself on the ground. With every cell of her body, she was feeling that something was terribly wrong. Her dad and her brother were gone, and she knew from, what had been going on around her that this was a bad thing. And so children really do feel this, and they carry it forward. And I saw it in her, in the friendships that she tried to make. She tried to find people to be hers, friends that would be her friend, that she would be their friend, that they would sort of be hers. And that wasn't met very well by a lot of kids. She experienced a lot of rejection. She was very angry. And we've now, now that she's a young adult, and at the time, I knew that it was related to her experiences of loss, but I wasn't sure what to do with it. And she had some school experiences that were really difficult for her because of the way that she tried to do relationships, and people did not understand what she needed. Another piece of advice um, that I would give parents, and it was something I tried to do that I believe would have made a huge difference for her, is if you have a child who has had a loss, whether especially I'd say if it's a sibling, but any kind of loss like a parent, try to help them get connected with another child their age that has had the same experience. Because when they're the only one going through this in their peer group, there's so much about their responses to the world and to law, to other relationships, like living next door to this family of 4 siblings who had been friends with her brother as well as her, and now had each other and she didn't have anyone. That was such a tremendous source of pain for her over the years. But if she could have had someone that understood what that feels like, I know that would have made a difference for her. So it is difficult. The flip side of that is that she's sensitive to other people's feelings. She's so smart and wise about other people's pain, and she has such uncanny ways of recognizing what people need and how to respond to that in really supportive ways. And this is another thing that the research bears out, is that a lot of times these kids grow up with these sensitivities. So she didn't have necessarily the typical social skills, but she had these other really amazing social sensibilities about what's going on with people. So they are different children. She's a different child, but she is who she is, and she's beautiful, and she was shaped by her losses, no doubt, and had a lot of, challenges because of it.
I feel like you're describing me in a lot of
Oh,
ways. I lost my dad when I was 8.
okay.
But then I
Yes.
had some other things that happened in my life thereafter. But, just like you, I was called the crybaby and couldn't show my emotions. And I'm an empath. I
Mm-hmm.
know that now. Oh my
Mm-hmm.
gosh, it took
Mm-hmm.
me like 30 plus years, 35 years to figure that out.
Yeah.
Sounds like your daughter is much like the
Mm-hmm.
same.
Mm-hmm.
Is she starting to step into those gifts, because it can feel like a curse? And
She isn't. She's not too long out of college and is really feeling like she needs to not have obligations. I mean, she is working, but she's not necessarily working in her field or in these areas where she really is so gifted, because she just kind of needs to be her and grow into herself now. And she's really doing that and feeling much better about that, because she's out of the environments where there was so much comparison that she felt she didn't always measure up to. So, and I think what you bring up is, which is why another piece that I just think is important, and I don't have any specific ways to do it, but if parents recognize, and I think one of the biggest things I did for Deanna was, no matter what she was receiving outside from me, she was receiving the understanding that I knew what was going on with her, and that I supported her, and that she had these gifts, and that, you know, someday people would see these things in her, but how tough it was to be surrounded by people who didn't get her. So the one thing we can do as parents of children who have these experiences is just say, you know, I understand that when you're angry, you know, it's not, you're not being a bratty kid necessarily, you know, there's more going on here, and just advocate for them. So I hope she steps into it. I'm so glad that you are doing this and that you're sharing your gifts, because it is so huge that you're doing this, and that you're, you know, shining a light on those things that you came to understand later in your life. Better late than never, you
Better
know.
late than never. And I think
Mm-hmm.
too, as you know, the sooner I I look back, I'm a mom, right, to three
Mm-hmm.
kids, but it's like I look at their younger years and just think of how differently I would have parented them had I worked through a lot of the stuff that I've since worked through only in the
Yes.
past
Yes.
3 years, you know. And that's the thing with addressing our own grief as
Mm-hmm.
parents is the greatest gift we can give our children is working on ourselves.
Yes,
I fully
absolutely.
believe that.
Very first number one thing in my course and in my working with parents is, very first number one thing is, you must take care of yourself. That's not selfish. That is the best way to help your family, because if you're not taking care of your grief and taking care of your needs, you know, your children, you are a role model for your children first of all. And yes, absolutely. Mm-hmm.
So, what has your grief taught you? I mean, you've shared a lot, but is there anything that personally your grief has taught you?
Um, it's taught me that there are really heartbreaking things in life, but they are in life. They are part of life. Nobody's immune to it. And there are ways to just, I mean, really make the lemonade. There are ways to just say, this doesn't define me. Um, you know, I'm just gonna, I can walk, I can live forward, walk forward, see my way forward through this, and it's going to change everything. It changes everything. But it's, that doesn't mean it's bad. I, of course, I yearn for some of the things, you know, some of the care. I yearn for a carefree childhood for my daughter that she never had. But this is good too. And so really, I think your part of your message, and definitely a huge part of mine, is that we have it now. Just what grief has taught me is that there are gifts in it, um, just like there are gifts in so many other things in life. Some of our greatest gifts come from some of the hardest things. And would I give up all the gifts to have my son back? Oh, you bet I would. I wouldn't think twice. But yeah, grief has gifts in it. And that's why my program is called Good Grief Parenting, because Grief is good. It is really how we heal. And people who refuse to face grief or to deal with it are the ones who have the hardest time, not the people who consent to and allow themselves to just feel the pain of it, because that is how we heal.
So I want to bring up a point or a question, and then I have another point.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just going to make a quick note here, so I circle back to it. Did people sometimes look at you and think you were just Pollyanna, like you were just really like this is just like you're too positive about your grief, because you had resources and you had
Mm-hmm.
different trainings that other people didn't,
Mm-hmm.
and so I can imagine that others would look at you and who are maybe grieving themselves at first without really knowing you,
Mm-hmm.
thinking, "Oh, yeah, that's great. That's."
No, it was strong. It was strong. That's the thing that people say. Because when people look at a family that's lost a child, and I'm sure in other environments, if you've lost a spouse, it can be similar. No matter how you are, when people look at you, they're going to see this, how awful that and devastating that is, because they can't imagine. And that's why I champion the sibling too, because the parental grief is so front and center for everybody that they don't even think about the child. But what people would say to me was, "You're so strong." And I know a lot of us as grievers get that accolade. And it's not that we're strong. It's like, what do you expect us to do? Be this heap on the ground, this puddle on the floor? And what people do when they say you're strong is they think she doesn't need any help, she doesn't need support. So then you don't get, over the years, I felt like I just really didn't get the support that I would have loved to have had from other people who just wanted to come around me and be there for me. Not that I needed any big specific thing from them, but for anyone listening, really please take that to heart, that the griever who looks like they're doing so well still really needs for you to be able to say, I'm missing that David isn't here right now, if you're the neighbor with all the kids, or whatever. So that was really the piece that I experienced more. And I will say that I went back and was doing early childhood parent education again after my son died, and really got so much positive feedback from the parents in those classes, because I was able to talk with them about their children. And sometimes I'd tear up, we're talking about little kids my children's ages, and I'd say, "This is just something I do. Don't worry about me. I'm okay." But and they just really felt like I was a good example for them. And so that was really heartwarming for me, because I do feel like more people saw me as an example than a Pollyanna. I don't remember anybody really looking at it that way.
It's like when people who are really resistant to looking at their grief,
Yes,
they
yes,
can look at people who have come on the other side of it or who are working through it and have a
yes.
positive attitude about it
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
as being Pollyanna, or like this, "It's great over here, just come over
Mm-hmm.
here." That's the heartbreaking thing for me, is, and maybe for you too in doing this work, is that you see people just suffering. And
Yes,
that's why I say it's like, you're already
yes.
suffering, suffer and move your feet, take some
Yes,
action,
you
do
can do
something.
both. And living forward doesn't mean you don't hurt anymore. I still to this day will have what I call my temper tantrum moments. I still have them. I'll probably get off this podcast and sit there and say, "Michele, I don't believe I sat there and just talked about this like it was nothing." And I may cry for a while, because I still am so I want my son back. I want my daughter to have her brother. Still, I still have my little temper tantrum moments, but we have a good life. We're living forward. We can never have him. But I do hear what you're saying, and I'm sensitive about it because the grief community kind of deals with it differently. There are people out there, influencers out there who really affirm those people who say, people try to tell you it's going to get better, it's always going to hurt. And it's like, I'm not saying that. I'm simply saying you can live forward. And that's why I work with young families, because how heartbreaking if the parents can't live forward and they've got a 3-year-old daughter who feels half of me is gone. And I have met some of those adults. I have met adults who were those 3-year-old daughters who say, I wish you'd been there when my parents lost my sibling, because they were absolutely crushed and they never recovered. And that is heartbreaking to me. That doesn't need to happen.
And for the child, it's as if they've lost 3 people.
Yes. And
If
they've lost their future too, because it will
yeah.
never be the same.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you for this conversation, because I really feel like it's part of loss, especially in young children, that hasn't been addressed on this podcast yet. And I think it's so important, because I identify as a child griever and I understand what that feels like.
Yes.
But I also, and I was the youngest of 4 siblings. I was kind of an only child. My brother was 14, when our father passed away. And so I was kind of left to my own devices, really.
Did you get, I mean, do you feel like any of the children got much support?
Absolutely
Did you
not.
Oh,
No.
yeah.
And again, it's my mom had her own grief that she had. She was
Yes.
not
Yes.
dealing with it. She didn't know how. There was
Yes.
nobody, like when you were speaking about talking with, pairing that child up with somebody else, there was nobody.
Right.
Nobody knew what to do with me. And so they just didn't do anything.
Exactly. And I live in a metropolitan area, and I still was not able to accomplish that for my daughter. And I will say that, I'm doing what I'm doing because of my daughter. At the same time, I recognize that I do recognize that I had resources and a mindset as an early childhood parent educator going into this that most parents don't have. And so when I work with families, I start from the very beginning. I start with that self-care. I start with those, I call them good grief beliefs. All that stuff we learn in the grief recovery method about how we regard grief in ways that are not helpful. As adults, we need to learn that first so that we can look at what our children and our families really need. So even though my why is my daughter, what I'm doing now really addresses what the parents need as well. And parents in those little towns like the one I grew up in, where there's no grief center, there aren't a lot of, there aren't probably grief therapists that are really trained in grief up there. I can be reached, you can be reached. Those of us who are doing the online presence can be reached and be support for those families, because it's really a helpless place to be, and we haven't learned how to deal with it.
Yeah, and especially with COVID-19 and all the other
Yes.
loss that families and everything have experienced on top of any other sibling loss that they have had, or parent loss.
Right.
What are some of, okay, I want to circle back to, I have a question here written down. So when your daughter, if as a parent, you lose a child and the child loses a sibling, what were some of the things that you saw? Now you had the education and the tools, but for a parent who may not, how can they recognize if their child, which we both know the child is going to be grieving, but I know for me personally, people probably thought I was doing okay.
Right.
I wasn't an outward I didn't lash out. I wasn't an
Mm-hmm.
angry, I didn't have outbursts. I was
Mm-hmm.
tardy a lot. I had problems concentrating. These other things that
Yes.
many people would probably say is ADHD or
Right.
ADD or something like that, which is, in my personal opinion, sorely misdiagnosed for grief in a lot of cases.
Mm-hmm.
But what are some of the things that you can points you can give to parents, things to look for, like?
I would just say that, and I want to say, you say you wish you knew now what or knew then what you knew now when you started parenting your children. I feel the same way. I have conversations with Deanna now and say, I wish I could go back and do this over again with you because I know so much more now. But one of the biggest things is, yes, we don't think we don't they don't show their grief in the same way. They show it a lot through play. If you pay attention, they'll grieve, and then they'll just appear to be fine because they can't hold on to grief very long. It's intense for them. And so kids don't grieve continuously. They grieve in spurts. And a lot of times they don't look like they're grieving, but you can be sure they are, because they were aware of this person, they loved this person, even if it was a really like an infant sibling that they didn't have there for a long time. They know that presence is gone. So just as parents, know that whether they are telling you or not, whether they appear or not, they are grieving, and you can initiate conversation in really simple ways by acknowledging. If they see you crying, you can say, oh, I miss your brother today. Do you miss your brother sometimes too? Just give them an opportunity, and they may or may not talk, and that's okay. But you are telling them it's okay for them to talk about it. So the first thing I would say is, don't think about trying to protect the child from grief, because they're grieving whether you see it or not. And the best thing you can do is invite conversation and open the door. Take care of yourself so that they can see, mommy is having a hard time right now, so I'm going to just go, sit outside in the sun for a while because I'm feeling really sad and I need to take care of myself, and you can come out with me. Or let them know how you're dealing with it in a positive way. Invite conversation. And the other thing, as I mentioned earlier, is that idea of nurturing the relationship with their sibling, simply by speaking the person's name, by saying, oh, if David were here, he'd love to play that game with you. Or those kinds of things are normalizing. They're not, parents are afraid to bring it up. I mean, it's just like my daughter saying, oh, if her brother were here, good, he'd be in school with me. They like the idea of the sibling, whether the sibling's there or not. So just helping parents change that mindset. And so the conversation piece is huge. And the acknowledging their own grief and the way that they're taking care of it is huge. Honoring the child's grief when they see it. This is that grief recovery method piece, and I include this in my little good grief guide that's available on my website. Some real specific ways to respond to children's grief instead of the let's get your mind off it response that we have so often. So those are some concrete things any parent, if they just let go of their fear of saying the wrong thing or making their child sad when they're not sad, if you can just let go of that and allow grief to be normal, let your child know that you feel it, and yes, they feel it, and it's okay. That's one of the hugest things you can do for your child, is just not be afraid of that grief and just talk about it.
I love that. So also too, now does this change with age? As they
Does
get
what change?
older, like how you respond and things. Like when
Yes.
when is there when is the line where they need more help, with what you're seeing?
Well, this is my caveat, I guess, is that I'm an early childhood parent educator. And so my focus is on the early years and all of this formative stuff. And a lot of people who know that I do this work will say, oh, my friend's, teenager died and their 12-year-old is suffering. And I don't feel nearly as well equipped to deal with that because I know it's different, number one, and because some of the things that are so helpful have already gotten in place in that, maybe the family doesn't talk about tough things. So then it's hard to suddenly start doing it. But I would say that with older children too, opening the door, not allowing grief to be an elephant in the room. And sometimes the children will, maybe not appear to be receptive. They won't want to talk. And if they don't want to talk, don't force it, but just make it always available. You have social workers in schools, people that you can talk to if you feel there's something going on. Just know too that when you see kids who have experienced a loss doing behaviors that that are not typical for them, anything that's not typical for them, they're not eating the same, they're not doing the same activities, they're not good in school anymore. Sometimes a child can start being a people pleaser because they don't want to upset the adults around them that are dealing with grief. So, anytime a child's behavior kind of shifts in a way where you're not sure what it's about and they've experienced a loss, it's time maybe to take a look at that. And one of the first things I did also with my daughter, I did find her a child counselor, a therapist, even before her son died, or her brother died, because I knew he was going to die, so that she just had someone to go and do play therapy with for those early years of her life. So yes, just giving them opportunities and being mindful of something that's uncharacteristic would be my offerings.
In the information that you filled out for us recording, there was one part that you said that you've experienced miracles, and I'm curious what miracles.
Oh, well, my faith is such a huge part, and I experienced miracles in along David's journey, and some things that were better than, the original diagnosis appeared to be one thing, and then it was like we got a reprieve, and that wasn't it at all, and we sort of got this reprieve, and I really felt that was miraculous. But it was more about some of the things that I personally got, and they're not real short stories, but I'll try to make them short. One was that before my son was ever diagnosed, I was in a Michael's store. It was he got his cancer. We found it in December, and there was this yarn angel. And for some reason, I wanted to buy it. I don't typically buy stuff like that. It was just this yarn angel, and it was called the Angel of Peace. And when I went to buy it, I just thought, oh, I wish it was the Angel of Joy, because that's what Christmas is to me. And a few days later, my son was diagnosed with cancer, and I was just really so aware that that Angel of Peace had been given to me for a purpose. The fact that I saw, the fact that I even cared what it was called was just really a message to me. The other thing that is truly a bona fide, nobody can argue with it, miracle is when my way one fall day.
I'm sorry. Can you restart that part because you froze?
I got a flash. Your internet is unstable. Yes. So when in the midst of my son's cancer, there was a weekend in the fall where my husband took our two children to visit his brother in another town so I could have the weekend to myself. And one of the things I always do in the fall is make apple crisp. And I had this family recipe that was the best, no comparison, apple crisp. But I had lost that recipe years ago. I knew I had it in the house we lived in, but I had somehow misplaced it, hadn't been able to make it for a number of years. But every fall, I would still rifle through everything in my kitchen and look for this recipe, and I never found it. So this weekend, when he was gone with the kids, I started to rifle through the kitchen again, and I stopped and I stood in the middle of the kitchen and I said, God, you know where this recipe is. And if I don't find it, I'm going to go crazy. And I said that, and I stepped aside and I bent down like this, and I looked under the edge of the cabinet on the wall. And from the back of the cabinet, between the cabinet and the wall, there was a little corner piece of paper sticking down. And I pulled it out with my thumbnail, and it was my recipe card. No one, I have that recipe card in a plastic bag now because it's got God's fingerprint on it. That's a bona fide miracle.
I got
So
goosebumps with your first
yes.
story too. Yeah.
Well, and I also heard my son talking when his cancer came back. I heard him talking one night. His dad and I both heard it on the intercom, and my son was saying, "I don't want to die. I don't want to die." And then he said, "All right, I'll come." And so I knew. I knew. And that was a miracle. And that was a gift too, because I knew. And when we talked to him in the morning, we kind of said, "Oh, did you talk to anybody?" He didn't remember it. But that night, or a couple days later, when we were in the hospital, he was talking about Jesus, and he was saying things we had not told him. So yes, there were miracles. There were miracles.
Thank you for sharing
Mm-hmm.
that. And I think it speaks to the importance of our faith when we
Yes.
go through things like this, and just really understanding that just because our loved one passes, and I don't know, there's all different kinds of listeners with all different kinds
Right.
of belief systems and things, but I personally believe, which I didn't always, because
Mm-hmm.
when my dad passed away, like for many, many years, probably the next 20 years, I thought when you die, you go on the ground and that was it.
Mm-hmm.
Like there was no afterlife. There was
Yeah.
no continuation of the spirit. I've been sorely woken up in a lot of different ways to
Mm-hmm.
that, but and especially with my end of life doula certification training, it's really helped me open my mind even more
Yes, I
to
can
that.
imagine.
And so I'm curious how you've kind of, was that always for you, this belief?
Yes. Yes, it really was, from the time I was a young girl. And I do credit, I mean, like you, that I recognize that that not everyone shares the same beliefs, and so much of what I offer, I want parents to hear it and take value from it, no matter where they are in their own hearts with their beliefs. But as for me, I know that my relationship with God and Jesus, and my being able to count on Him. I mean, when people say I'm strong, I say that's what it is. I'm just assured. And I do look back at my life. I told you that I feel like this journey and this mission of helping parents understand, this deep part of what children need from them to affirm these emotions that are really difficult, like grief, started for me as a child, because I didn't feel like my parents were that way. And yet I always had that relationship, and my sisters didn't. So, I can see that difference and know what a difference it's made for me. And that's another piece that I'm so grateful for, because I always say, Why me? Why do I have this relationship when others in my family don't? And I'm not sure why, but I have always had it. Yeah.
Well, and even for the relationship to continue after your son
Mm-hmm,
passed,
mm-hmm.
right? If we have that, take comfort in that, knowing that we can still talk to them, or that we can
Exactly.
still feel their presence if we really just sit and maybe ask,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
being open to asking for that
Yes.
message or whatever it is, or, that feeling
Mm-hmm.
that can bring us great comfort. Um,
Yes.
I know you mentioned too, there was an author, Anne, how do you say it?
Roifi.
Royfi?
Roifi. I've only ever seen her name in print, so I say Roifi. I'm not sure if that's how she pronounces it.
Uh, but there, you say there's two parts to grief, or she says there's two parts to
Yes.
grief: loss
Yes.
and the remaking of a life. And I
Yes.
absolutely love that.
I do too. When I came across that early in my knowing that I wanted to help with families with this, I thought that's how I make the distinction. Is there are so many people that are there to help us deal with loss, and thankfully so. The grief groups, the therapists, all of those. What I want to do is step in, behind that or concurrently with that, and say yes. Now we need to remake life. We still have life, but it's not the same. It can't ever be the same, but we can remake it, and we can choose how to remake it. And yeah, I love that quote. It's just very simple, a very simple but clear way of looking at loss and grief.
So, what would you like to scream to the world and wish that people knew and understood about sibling loss, about your grief? I mean, you've shared a lot of
Mm-hmm.
great wisdom, but is there anything else that you can think of?
The two things that I would scream, the two things that are three things that are so important to me. The first one is um, that we need to talk about grief and normalize it and not be afraid of it, and support people in the midst of it. I mean, we just really need to be able to talk about it. And the other piece is for people to really understand that siblings hurt. Any sibling, any sibling that you talk to, whether they lost their sibling when they were 50 or whether they lost them when they were 5, they will tell you the same thing, that people really didn't seem to, take into account their grief. And it is so identity shifting for every sibling to lose a sibling. And so that is something that if someone said you can just give one message to the world, Michele, it would be know that siblings grieve, and help them grieve, and help them through it. And I know I said there were three things, but I don't remember what the third one was that popped into my head. But yeah, those are the two things really.
Do you see a lot more people coming to you for support when their child loses an only sibling, like when they only have just the one sibling that like if there's just the two children and one passes away? Or do because I think there can be this comfort as a parent that
Mm-hmm.
you would take if
Mm-hmm.
one child passes and there's two others, like
Yes.
they still have another sibling to support and, walk through
Mm-hmm.
life with. But
Mm-hmm.
I
I
don't want
think
to, I think it's important to not take away, though, that the individual relationships are still individual.
exactly. And you're right. And I've thought about that a lot because of course I'm doing what I'm doing. I founded this on my one experience with my one daughter. And that's not at all universal. Every child is going to experience it in their own way. I think the idea that the sibling bond is strong for all siblings, I think that's universal. But it's not going to be as painful for every sibling, and it's not going to look the same way for every sibling. I have worked mostly with families that have, just the single remaining sibling. Um, and yeah, I look forward to working more with families who have more children, because you may have one child who's really, really suffering and one child who is adjusting better. Um, So yes, you bring up such an important point, and it's a good point to make anyway, which is not all kids are the same. Not all children are like my daughter. Um, so I use my examples, but your child is totally different, and I recognize that. And if you've got more than one child, you're not going to have a one size fits all way of helping those children through their grief, because they're going to do it differently.
Well, and I even just thought of when there's multiples, if you're a
Yeah. Oh yeah.
twin and your twin passes, but yet you have other siblings, and yet that was
Mm-hmm.
your twin,
Yes. Yeah.
or
Mm-hmm.
triplet, or whatever the case may
Mm-hmm.
be, or you lost one of your siblings at birth as a
Right.
multiple. I mean, there's so many different
There are.
scenarios, right? Like,
There are.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So, throughout your grief experience, what has given you the most joy, and what gives you the most hope for the future?
The most joy really has been as I've started to do this work. And I've had parents for whom it's made such a difference. That is the greatest joy for me, to know that someone is seeing. The name of my course that I offer is See Your Way Forward After Child Loss, and that is really what I want to help them do. And for a parent to come in and say, I just didn't know how to be a parent, I just didn't know how I could do it, and just 6 months later have a totally different view of seeing their way forward. And I use the word living forward, because I don't want to say moving forward. That's not the right connotation. It's we're going to live and we're going to go forward. When we're living forward, and we choose how to do that. And that gives me the greatest joy, is just knowing that that what I have offered has worked, has been a key for some other parents. Because as I said, I knew I was working from my own experience. And if there's anything we know in grief, this, because you've talked to so many people, it's different for everybody. I can't tell you what I did and say, now go out and do that and you'll be happy. That's not at all what I try to do or want to do or believe that I can do. And so when what I offer does help someone make their own way, that's the greatest joy. And what was the other question you asked?
Hope for the future. What gives
Oh,
you hope for the future?
um, well, that's the same thing that gives me hope, because the other piece, as we know, those of us who have worked with the grief recovery method, is that whole mindset around grief that needs to shift. And if I can teach parents how to do emotion coaching and things that build really good coping skills and resilience in their young children, and help their children grow up with healthy attitudes about how to deal with grief when it comes, because it's going to come again, then those children are going to grow up and be adults who know how to do it with their own children. And that is hope. So I look at it as, it's not just the families that I'm helping, it's the legacy that they're going to build that's going to be carried on by their children. And that's really hopeful.
And it's intervention.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I love that. It's the ripples of the work that we
Yes.
do.
Yes. Exactly.
Is there anything else you would like to share?
No, I know that I've gone far and wide. It's not hard to talk with you about these things. There's just so much to say. And I just really want to invite people anywhere to visit my website, www.goodgriefparenting.com. And I'm putting on there, I have a community page where I'm trying to just provide places for people to tap into what can serve them. the things that I do, the course that I offer, the coaching that I offer, and make them aware of the podcast that I'm on, because there are I'm just discovering as things have changed so much in the 20 years that I've been on this journey. I just really encourage people to look for the resources that are out there and find the ones that speak to you and serve you, and be open to absorbing some different ways of looking at grief and recognizing that it really can be good. It's not something to avoid and protect our children from, because it's just a part of life, and it can be an enriching part of life. So,
Or a
yeah,
debilitating one.
it
We
can.
choose. We
We
choose.
choose, yes, and that is the whole point. And I like to, encourage people, but yes, and not choosing to live forward is a choice as well, a choice to stay stuck in a place that doesn't feel good. So that's why I just really do encourage anyone listening to your podcast to, you've got so many examples of stories, and there's so many good resources out there, and be open, and you don't have to let go of your loved one. Healing does not mean you leave your loved one behind. And that's something I know a lot of parents struggle with. They don't want to quit hurting over their child, because then they're forgetting their child, and they don't want to do that. And that's really not true. We can live forward with them.
I love that. And you mentioned your course, which is See Your Way Forward After Child Loss. It's a
Yes.
5-week program, and you're starting it. You have one starting at this time of this recording.
Yes.
It's the end of July, and it's going to start in August. But you're going to have another one later this year too.
Yes, in November as well. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And all of that information is on my website.
And I will have the link to that in the show notes, as well
Mm-hmm.
as where people can find you on social, which is where?
Yes. I prefer Instagram. I'm at Michele Benyo _good grief. It's Michele Benyo with one L, MicheleBenyo. And there are two of us on Instagram. So I'm the one with _good grief.
All right. Thank you for sharing that.
Mm-hmm.
And thank you for being my guest today.
Yes.
It's been my honor to have you, and for sharing your story of cumulative loss, which is never have I had an interview with someone who has not had cumulative loss.
Yes, exactly. We don't realize it until we start looking at it. Yes.
Yeah. So
thank you, Victoria, for the opportunity. I've just really enjoyed talking with you, and really enjoyed looking at your podcast as well. So thank you.
Thank you for listening. And remember, when you unleash your heart, you unleash your life. Much love.